One of the greatest things about Dungeons and Dragons is that if the designers have a different vision for the game than we do, we have the power to fix it. Though I'm a big proponent for rules as written play and rules mastery and trying before modifying your games of Dungeons and Dragons, when subscriber Twinsteel suggested this topic of house rules to consider before getting started with D&D 2024, I was intrigued. Since he'd also loaned me his copy of the Player's Handbook in order to do these kinds of reviews, how could I not look into it for him? In exchange for Twinsteel's generosity, he did ask that I check out a list of his favored underrated creators and give shout outs to those of them that I was intrigued by. And so today I am giving a shout out to Josh, the GM philosopher, and there's a video at the end that you can check out with some house rule ideas of his own. Because not everyone can have a familiar like mine, this video is sponsored by what might just be your next Dungeons & Dragons familiar, Dungeon Dreamer. Coming to Kickstarter soon, this ethically focused AI companion is set to revolutionize how you look to your computer for help as a player or a DM of the world's greatest role-playing game. Already you can head to their website and make a character as much as 60 times faster than you ever have before. Literally all you need is a story or a few words of inspiration, and Dungeon Dreamer can work out all of the other details, the mechanics and all, to deliver you an editable PDF with your character sheet ready to go in less than a minute. Even as you're typing, it's picking out keywords to determine what you want or intuiting them from your story to give you what will work best. Making characters fast is pretty cool and all, but as a forever DM, what really gets me excited is Dungeon Dreamer's Kickstarter goals, which start with creating monster stat blocks, including custom actions and custom art, all through a written prompt and balanced within the rules, as much as the CR system allows anyway. On top of that, what really sets Dungeon Dreamer apart is their commitment to being ethically sourced in their artificial intelligence use, making agreements with artists and creators in the homebrewing community and paying royalties for what's used by their tightly trained AI. With a lot of other ambitious goals played out through their Kickstarter game plan, if you're interested in a familiar that's a little less cute than mine, but way more useful, then you should check out Dungeon Dreamer and get signed up to be notified for when their Kickstarter goes live. Of the 9 house rules that I have for you to consider today, the first one is me cheating and slotting 3 of them together because 11 just didn't seem like as fun a number as 9. Treantmonk's 3 house rules were ones that I adopted over a year ago, and thus they've seen hundreds of games of play at my tables. They've been really successful at leveling out the power curve of marshals in their various types, as well as marshals versus casters in my games of 2014 Dungeons & Dragons. The first of these 3 rules was to allow a power attack, essentially the Great Weapon Master's -5 on attack roll in order to add 10 to the damage roll, and this was given as a base ability that anybody could use as part of the attack action. And we used this wholesale, and it was really awesome, and I think that that particular rule is worth nixing and is no longer one of the rules that I'm planning on putting into my 2024 version games. And the reason for that is because Power Attack Great Weapon Master is no longer the same. And so Wizards has done the work of rebalancing marshals so that they're going to have competitive opportunities for sword and board and dual wield and your Great Weapon Master and your sharpshooters. They're all been rebalanced, and I don't want to mess with that balance out of the gate because I want to see how that measures up, and I don't think that rule's worth adopting. But the other 2 portions of the Treantmonk house rules still have some potential merit. The first of those is the removal of the shield spell. Now, admittedly, we were all hoping that shield was going to get a bit of a rebalance, and at first glance we see that shield exactly the same in the rules as it was in 2014. The difference that has made it to where I'm questioning the removal of shield is that other features, particularly martial features that increase your armor class in similar ways have now been made to last just as long as shield does, all the way through the round back until your turn again. And so the question is it still worth nerfing the shield spell because of how powerful it could be on a optimized multi-class character who's rocking full plate mail and a shield as well as the shield spell, when you could have a full plate mail and shield character that is using the defensive duelist ability at high levels to get an even higher bonus, or a Battlemaster's evasive footwork that allows them to add a modifier to their armor class for the entire round. And it is a little bit more questionable. I am thinking that it might be still worth using the variant version of shield that we've been utilizing in my games, where it only lasts until the end of the turn in which it's cast, but I'm not positive that that is necessary anymore, but it's something that you could consider for your table. The other of the Treantmonk house rules, which would lean me towards leaving shield intact, is the rule for armor proficiency, which essentially by his rule means that you can't cast any leveled spell if you are wearing armor that the proficiency you were given for that was from a different class. So if you're a sorcerer paladin, for instance, sorcerer giving you no armor proficiency and paladin giving you full plate mail, if you are wearing the full plate mail or indeed any armor, you can't use any of your sorcerer spell slots in order to cast sorcerer spells. You can use them in order to cast any of your paladin spells and indeed to smite like crazy, but you can't use them for all these cool sorcerer spells that you added to your list. And this works out in order to keep sorcerers and wizards and warlocks at a lower armor class than the paladin is going to be in the full plate mail and everything, so that you don't just run into a quick dip in order to bump your armor class up to really awesome levels while still living with the best spells in the game of a wizard with a single level cleric dip or a sorcerer with a paladin dip. I think that of these three rules, if you adopted the armor rule and kept that one into your 2024 edition game of D&D, that it would balance things out to where you didn't need to adjust shield, or at least to where I would be tempted to leave shield intact as it was so that we could see how it all plays out. But you'll have to judge that for your table. The second house rule, if we can call it the second house rule, that I would consider is the possibility of using an adjustment to surprise. The new surprise rules mean that you no longer have a blowout of everybody getting their turn before the bad guys get their turn. Instead, it just imparts a disadvantage on your initiative checks for those who are surprised and gives advantage on those who were hidden before the battle started, so that you're more likely to have the ambushers go first rather than the ambushees. However, one of the things that also did was removed any adjustment to action economy, in particular the fact that now you can make your reaction during that round of surprised combat, whereas before you didn't get your reaction till after your initiative came up. And I would consider as a house rule allowing that old rule about your reactions to carry forward into the new edition. This would essentially just mean that if you ambushed somebody from jumping out of a bush nearby, you could surprise them enough to be able to run past them without provoking an opportunity attack because they didn't have the reaction to take it. Or if you surprised a wizard and loaded attacks against them, you could get your attacks in without them having the opportunity to throw up a shield spell to protect themselves. It just fits the thematics and gives a few tiny little opportunities that I think would be good to keep in the game. The third house rule is not necessarily a house rule per se, but is rather a typical thing that you should be deciding on when you create your campaign, and that's your restrictions. Essentially, what books from 2014 through 2024 are you going to allow at your table? This is a tough one for a lot of tables, myself included, because there are a lot of cool subclasses that players might still want to use, especially with the changes to the primary classes, but we don't really know how they're going to interact and which ones were designed with the new philosophy in mind and so on and so forth. And so we're going to have to decide whether we're saying, hey, player's handbook only and moving forward from there, or whether or not we're going to allow older material, and if so, what older material. I would consider that probably going with a 2024 only rule would be a good way to balance things and ensure that things are in keeping with one another. And then I would allow a la carte plucking certain things from the previous books, mostly backgrounds, which are easily able to be customized by the essential rules that are in the player's handbook, and subclasses that you can probably port over if you're careful. I would definitely not allow any old feat that has been recreated in the new book, and I would consider not allowing any old feat at all, because there are certainly a couple of power creep-esque feats that really don't need to be included in the edition in order to continue to move forward. Elven Accuracy, I'm kind of looking at you. But as a more house rule, the fourth option that I would consider for 2024 D&D would be hitting 0 hit points a little more dangerous, since we've upped the degree to which we can avoid it, and we've improved characters in a number of ways to make them a little bit tougher, not to mention the improvements to healing of doubling most of the dice of healing spells that have been included in the book. I would consider giving a level of exhaustion to anybody who hits 0 hit points. And the way this would play out is that though you go through the usual death save thing, it means you can't afford to just play whack-a-mole healer where you let somebody get all the way unconscious before you bring them back up, because of that building penalty, as people get a -2 to all of their attack rolls and saving throws and ability checks until they can recover from that exhaustion. This has the added benefit of making Rangers the guy who is okay to beat on the most, which they probably didn't need that, but it is a pretty cool way to just balance things out and make player behavior match character realism, because letting people get knocked unconscious before you go and apply any kind of first aid seems like a pretty terrible way to manage healing in a fantasy world where you literally have magic that can heal wounds. Probably wouldn't actually want to wait for them to fall unconscious before you ran over to try and save them. That seems a little crazy. So adding this in there gives the players a mechanical incentive to avoid those situations, while adding a penalty to those who are knocked unconscious that doesn't feel too egregious, since these penalties are going to make them feel weaker, but they can deal with them with magic that reduces exhaustion, or by retreating and taking long rests. Speaking of exhaustion, a fifth house rule possibility would be to increase the detriment that exhaustion has in order to make it apply equally to spellcasters as well as marshals. A suggestion that was offered up was to have exhaustion apply a -2 penalty not just to attack rolls, saving throws, and skill checks, but also to saving throw DCs of abilities that you put forward and to your armor class, meaning that people with the lowest armor classes are going to be hit hard by this possibility, and your spellcasters are going to find their magic weaker and weaker, even if they aren't the kind of spellcaster that's constantly shooting attack rolls at their targets. Finding ways around the loopholes is pretty much why this house rule would be a decent inclusion, because it does feel a little bit weird for your exhaustion to mean that you're blasting magic away and not doing a very good job, or you're using other spells that are exactly perfectly as effective at all times, and really your exhaustion didn't matter whatsoever. The sixth house rule is a simple one to implement, and one that I suspect will be pretty ubiquitous at most tables, whether or not they acknowledge it on their list of house rules, and that's the possibility of using custom backgrounds. The rules as written in the 2024 Player's Handbook are pretty restrictive when it comes to the modifiers that your backgrounds are providing, either in terms of statistical modifiers or the feat that you are allowed to take. And if you don't allow custom backgrounds or older backgrounds, then you have a pretty tight short list that you are not quite forcing people into if they want to get either the stat bonus that is most important to them or the feat that is most important to them. Picking and choosing those is, in my experience so far with converting characters over to the new rules, actually kind of a pain in the neck, and players find it quite difficult to figure out the narrative reason why they would take this choice, and also find it difficult to mechanically make the choice of which of those two options to let not be their optimal choice. Though the rules don't include an option for custom backgrounds, the formula is incredibly simple, and the rules in there for how to convert an old background are basically the rules you would use in order to create a custom background. I suspect a lot of tables will allow this, and though it does mean that we're not going to be pushing towards having more humans at the table like I was talking about in a video previously, it does open again the field for everybody to have the creative option that they want. I personally like having restrictions in my games because I feel like that breeds creativity in and of itself, but you judge for what's going to be best for your table and your players. Our 7th house rule is a simple addition of adding the word hostile back into the wording for opportunity attacks. Currently, as they're worded in the player's handbook, opportunity attacks are taken whenever a creature leaves your reach, meaning that if your ally runs close to you and moves away, they provoke an opportunity attack. Obviously, you're not going to be stabbing a bunch of your friends, so that's not a big deal unless you combine it with the Warcaster feat that allows you to cast a single target spell on somebody who is leaving your reach, which could mean that you're casting healing or buff spells as a reaction on your allies as they move in and out. If you don't want to allow that kind of play at your table, then simply adding the word hostile back into opportunity attacks as a house rule takes away that loophole, so you no longer have your cleric and wizard standing at the back of the group, and as soon as your paladin leaps forward, your wizard and your cleric are both buffing them, and whenever your rogue needs a quick heal, they dash past your cleric and the cleric can drop a healing spell on them as a reaction. If that's not the kind of play that you want at the table, then removing that means adding this back in. Our penultimate house rule for the day was submitted by subscriber Owen Vey 1765, who suggested that when we take an origin feat as a feat after 4th level, we could modify those feats by allowing them to also have an attribute modifier, an ability score increase, added to that feat so that it matched up with all of the other general feats and gave them enough oomph to make them worth taking later on in the game. Though you might have to decide what attributes you can specifically add to, as taking Tavern Brawler while getting a buff to your wisdom or charisma is probably a little strange. This seemed like a simple addition that would make those origin feats feel powerful enough to be taken later on in your career, and if you're combining this house rule with not taking an option for custom backgrounds or older backgrounds, then it's one way around the restrictive nature of the player's handbook background system, so that you keep that little bit of restriction while allowing people to build out towards their vision over time. The final house rule to suggest is that we either ban or modify the Conjure Minor Elementals spell. There's already been a number of different builds put out by some pretty awesome creators out there that have suggested just how much damage this particular spell could allow. For instance, Valor Bards being able to go dual wield ham and unleash just absolutely horrendous amounts of damage every single round by utilizing this spell that allows you to add 2d8 to every attack that hits and scales at a whopping 2d8 for every spell slot above its base 4th. That's a little bit insane, and it doesn't seem to match up with any of the other numbers of spells that have been put into the game, making it very questionable exactly whether or not this was a typo or intended by the design team. But either reducing the amount of additional dice that come from upscaling on this particular spell or banning it entirely would solve the problem, and so taking a close look at how you're going to allow that particular spell is probably worth doing. Don't forget to check out this video of unconventional house rules from Josh, the GM philosopher. Incidentally, he shouts Twin Steel out in his video too. Small world. Thanks for watching. Happy adventuring.